"Excuse me, ma'am, but I believe you're in my seat." Marcus Washington's voice was calm, but carried an unmistakable authority that made nearby passengers glance up from their phones. Patricia Anderson didn't even acknowledge him at first, her perfectly manicured fingers continuing to scroll through what appeared to be luxury vacation listings, each destination costing more than most people's annual income. "I'm quite settled here, thank you," she replied without looking up, her tone carrying the dismissive quality of someone who had never been told no in her entire privileged life. "Perhaps you could find something more suitable elsewhere." Marcus stepped closer, his 6'2" frame casting a shadow over seat 2A. His boarding pass, slightly wrinkled from the rush through security, clearly showed the same seat number. "Ma'am, this is my assigned seat. I'd appreciate it if you could check your boarding pass and move to your correct location." Patricia finally raised her head, her cold blue eyes sweeping over Marcus's casual attire with undisguised contempt. "Listen, I don't know what kind of game you're trying to play here, but I'm a Platinum Elite member of this airline. I specifically requested this seat, and I have no intention of moving for—" She paused, letting her gaze linger on his hoodie and jeans. Someone who clearly doesn't understand how first class works. The cabin fell silent. Other passengers pretended not to watch, but Marcus could feel every eye on him. What Patricia Anderson didn't know was that she had just challenged the wrong man on the wrong day. Because Marcus Washington wasn't just another passenger, and what he was about to do would change the airline industry forever. Marcus was exhausted. The kind of bone-deep weariness that came from 3 consecutive days of investor meetings in New York, where he'd spent countless hours proving his worth in conference rooms where he was often the only black face at the table. His casual attire, a premium black hoodie, dark designer jeans, and sneakers that cost more than most people's rent, was a deliberate choice. After years of suits and ties, sometimes a successful man just wanted to travel in comfort. But comfort, Marcus was learning, was a privilege that came with conditions when you looked like him. The first-class cabin of Flight 2847 was a study in understated luxury. Leather seats that cost more than many people's cars, ambient lighting designed to soothe the wealthy and powerful, and the kind of hushed atmosphere that money could buy. Marcus had flown this route dozens of times, but today felt different. Today he was being challenged in his own space by someone who couldn't see past the color of his skin. Patricia Anderson was everything Marcus had come to expect from old money privilege. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, her designer clothes immaculate, and her jewelry spoke of generational wealth. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never been denied anything, never been questioned, never been made to feel like she didn't belong. "Sir," Patricia continued, her voice taking on a patronizing tone that made Marcus's jaw clench, "I think you're confused about the situation here. This is first class, not coach. Perhaps if you spoke to the flight attendant, they could help you find your proper seat." The word proper hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus felt the familiar weight of coded language, the subtle implications that had followed him through Harvard Business School, through every boardroom negotiation, through every interaction where his presence was questioned simply because of the color of his skin. Behind him, other passengers were beginning to notice the hold-up. A distinguished older black couple in row 4 watched with expressions that suggested they knew exactly what was happening. They'd probably experienced similar situations themselves. In row 3, a Latina woman with a briefcase and legal documents was observing intently, her dark eyes moving between Marcus and Patricia with growing interest. Near the window in row 5, a young man with multiple cameras and what appeared to be streaming equipment was definitely recording, though he was trying to be subtle about it. His fingers moved quickly across his phone screen, and Marcus could see the telltale glow of a live stream interface. The flight attendants were busy with pre-flight preparations, but Marcus could see one of them, a young black woman named Lisa Williams, watching the interaction with concern. She seemed torn between intervening and allowing the passengers to resolve the situation themselves. Marcus glanced at his watch, a precision timepiece that had been a gift to himself after his company's latest acquisition. The gesture wasn't about checking time, it was about maintaining composure. In his backpack was a laptop containing emails that could move millions of dollars with a single keystroke, contracts that employed thousands of people and strategic plans that could reshape entire industries. But none of that mattered in this moment, because to Patricia Anderson, he was just another black man who didn't know his place. If you believe that no one should suffer discrimination like this, type justice below. Ma'am, Marcus said, his voice remaining level despite the familiar surge of frustration rising in his chest. I'm not confused about anything. This is seat 2A according to my boarding pass. I have a confirmed reservation for this seat and I'd like you to move. Patricia's laugh was sharp and dismissive. My dear, I think you're taking this far too seriously. Look around you. She gestured at the first-class cabin with its leather seats and premium amenities. Does this really seem like the kind of mistake that usually happens? I mean, when was the last time you actually flew first class? The question was designed to humiliate, to force Marcus to admit that he didn't belong, that this was all some kind of error that a simple conversation could resolve. Patricia's eyes glittered with the confidence of someone who had never been told that her assumptions about other people might be wrong. Marcus felt his phone buzz in his pocket, probably his assistant checking on his arrival time for the board meeting. There were emails to answer, calls to return, decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions of dollars in revenue. But all of that faded into the background as he stood in the aisle of this aircraft, being told by a woman who had likely never worked a day in her life that he didn't belong in a seat he had paid for. I fly first class every week, Marcus replied calmly, usually on this same route. And in 5 years of flying with various airlines, I've never had someone refuse to move out of my assigned seat. Patricia's smile became more strained. She hadn't expected him to push back with such quiet confidence, and Marcus could see her recalculating the situation. Her eyes swept over him again, taking in his young face and casual attire, clearly trying to reconcile his composed demeanor with her preconceptions about who belonged in first class. Well then, surely you understand how these things work, she said, her tone becoming more aggressive. Sometimes accommodations need to be made. I have a connecting flight in Los Angeles, and I specifically need a window seat for my work. I'm sure the airline can find you another seat that meets your requirements. The pause before requirements was deliberate, loaded with implication. Marcus caught the attention of the Latina woman in row 3, who was now taking notes on what appeared to be legal documents. Something in her expression suggested she was a lawyer, and she was documenting everything. The older black couple in row 4 had stopped pretending to read their magazines. The woman whispered something to her husband, and Marcus caught the words "not again" and "same thing happened to us." Their expressions held a mixture of sympathy and resignation that spoke to decades of similar experiences. The young man with the streaming equipment had positioned himself for a better angle. His viewer count was climbing steadily, and Marcus could see comments flooding across his screen. Words like discrimination, unbelievable, and this is wrong scrolled past faster than anyone could read. Mrs.? Marcus began, wanting to establish some formal ground for the conversation. Anderson. Patricia Anderson of Anderson Real Estate Holdings, she replied, clearly expecting the name to carry weight. Perhaps you've heard of us. We develop luxury residential communities throughout the West Coast. So I'm not just some random passenger. I'm a valued customer with specific needs and expectations. Marcus remained standing in the aisle, his boarding pass still in his hand, watching as Patricia performed what was clearly a well-rehearsed routine. He'd seen it before in boardrooms and networking events, the casual name-dropping, the assumption that credentials and connections could override basic fairness and decency. Mrs. Anderson, Marcus said, emphasizing her name to show he'd heard it. I'm sure you're very successful in your line of work, but success doesn't change seat assignments. This is 2A, and that's what my boarding pass clearly states. Patricia's demeanor shifted again. The polite veneer was starting to crack, revealing something uglier underneath. Listen to me very carefully, she said, leaning forward slightly. I don't know what kind of scheme you're running here, but I'm not playing along. I know exactly what you're trying to do. Make a scene, cause a fuss, probably hoping for some kind of compensation or upgrade. Well, it's not going to work with me. The accusation hit like a physical blow. Marcus felt the familiar surge of anger that came whenever someone suggested that his legitimate presence in spaces of privilege was somehow fraudulent or opportunistic. It was the same assumption that had followed him through his entire career, that a successful black man must be running some kind of con game. The tension in the cabin was becoming palpable. Other passengers were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, some pulling out their phones to record what was clearly escalating beyond a simple misunderstanding. What Marcus did next would shake the aviation industry to its core. The soft footsteps of regulation airline shoes on carpeted flooring announced the arrival of Lisa Williams, a 28-year-old flight attendant whose perfectly pressed uniform and practiced smile suggested she'd handled her share of passenger disputes. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her eyes moved quickly between Marcus and Patricia, already assessing the situation before she'd heard a word from either party. "Good afternoon," Lisa said, her voice carrying the trained cheerfulness of someone who had learned to diffuse tensions before they exploded into full-scale incidents. "I understand there's some confusion about seating arrangements. How can I help resolve this for you?" Patricia immediately leaned forward, her voice taking on the tone of an aggrieved victim who had been suffering in silence until forced to speak up. "Thank you for coming so quickly, Miss Williams. Lisa Williams. Miss Williams, I'm Patricia Anderson, Elite Platinum member for over 10 years. I've been sitting in this seat which I specifically requested when I booked, and this gentleman is claiming it's his." Lisa's eyes flicked to Marcus, and he caught something in her expression that he'd seen countless times before. It wasn't malicious exactly, but it was telling. A subtle shift that suggested she was already forming assumptions about who was likely telling the truth and who was likely causing trouble. "Sir," Lisa said, turning to Marcus with a smile that was noticeably less warm than the one she'd given Patricia, "may I see your boarding pass?" Marcus handed it over without comment, watching as Lisa examined it carefully. Her frown deepened as she looked from the boarding pass to the seat number above Patricia's head, clearly seeing that Marcus was indeed assigned to 2A. "Well," Lisa said slowly, "it does appear that this seat is assigned to you, Mr." She glanced at the boarding pass again. "Mr. Washington. However, I can see that Mrs. Anderson is already settled in, and she does have very high status with our airline." Marcus felt the familiar knot forming in his stomach. He'd seen this dance before, the careful diplomatic language that somehow always seemed to suggest that the black passenger should be the one to compromise, to be flexible, to understand that maintaining harmony was more important than maintaining his rights. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Marcus asked quietly. Lisa's smile became more strained. "Well, we do have several other excellent seats available in first class. Perhaps we could move you to 3C. It's an aisle seat with excellent legroom, and I'd be happy to ensure you receive priority service throughout the flight as compensation for the inconvenience." "The inconvenience?" Marcus repeated slowly. "You mean the inconvenience of someone else sitting in my assigned seat?" Patricia sensed an opening and took it. "I think that's a very reasonable solution," she said quickly. "I've already arranged my belongings here, and as I mentioned, I have specific needs related to my connecting flight. I'm sure Mr. Washington understands that sometimes flexibility is required when traveling." Lisa nodded encouragingly. "Mrs. Anderson does have a point. These kinds of mix-ups happen occasionally, and we've found that the best solution is usually the one that accommodates everyone's needs with minimal disruption." The Latina woman in row 3 cleared her throat and spoke for the first time. "Excuse me, but I'm a lawyer, and what I'm witnessing here appears to be discriminatory treatment. Mr. Washington has a valid boarding pass for this seat, and he's being asked to move to accommodate someone who apparently doesn't have a boarding pass for this seat." Lisa turned to address the new speaker, clearly flustered by the legal terminology. "Ma'am, this is just a customer service issue. We're trying to find a solution that works for everyone." "A solution that works for everyone," the lawyer repeated, "apparently means the black passenger gives up his seat. Is that standard airline policy?" The young man with the streaming equipment looked up from his phone. "My viewers are asking the same question. We're up to about 3,000 people watching now, and the comments are, well, let's just say people are not impressed with how this is being handled." Patricia whirled around to face him. "You're broadcasting this. You can't do that. This is a private conversation." "Actually," the lawyer interjected, "this is a public space, and discrimination in public accommodations is a matter of public interest." "Continue recording." Marcus looked around the first-class cabin. Several passengers were now openly watching the exchange, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. The older black couple in row 4 were nodding in recognition. They clearly knew exactly what was happening and had probably experienced similar situations themselves. A businessman in row 6 was shaking his head in disgust, while a young woman across the aisle was taking notes on her phone. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted from polite travel etiquette to something much more charged and uncomfortable. But Patricia had no idea who she was really dealing with. Lisa Williams was clearly in over her head. What had started as a routine seating dispute was rapidly becoming something much more complex, with legal implications and social media coverage that her standard customer service training hadn't prepared her for. "Perhaps," Lisa said, her voice strained with forced cheer, "I should get Captain Johnson involved. He has more authority to handle these kinds of complex situations." Patricia's face lit up with vindictive satisfaction. "Yes, I think that's an excellent idea. Let's get someone in charge who can explain proper procedures to Mr. Washington here." Marcus nodded slowly. "Please do. I'd very much like to speak with someone in authority." As Lisa hurried toward the cockpit, the silence in the cabin was broken by more murmured conversations among the passengers. The lawyer in row 3 was speaking quietly into her phone, presumably consulting with colleagues. The streaming influencer was providing live commentary to his growing audience, explaining the legal and social implications of what they were witnessing. "This is exactly the kind of systemic discrimination that civil rights lawyers have been fighting for decades," he was saying to his camera. "Watch how the airline staff automatically assume the white passenger is telling the truth and the black passenger should be accommodated elsewhere." Patricia overheard this and turned around angrily. "That's completely unfair. This has nothing to do with race. This is about customer service and airline procedures." The older black woman in row 4 finally spoke up, her voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. "Honey, I've been flying for 50 years, and I've seen this exact same scenario play out more times than I can count. It's always the black passenger who gets asked to be flexible." Her husband nodded in agreement. "We were on a flight to Atlanta last year, and the exact same thing happened to us. White couple in our seats, flight attendant suggested we move to accommodate them because they were premium passengers. That's different." Patricia protested. "This is a legitimate mistake, and I'm trying to resolve it reasonably." "By refusing to show your boarding pass?" the lawyer asked pointedly. "If this is your assigned seat, where's your documentation?" Patricia hesitated for the first time since the confrontation began. My boarding pass is in my purse somewhere, but I specifically requested this seat, and I always sit here when I fly this route." "So you don't actually have a boarding pass for seat 2A?" Marcus asked quietly. "I don't need to prove anything to you," Patricia snapped. "I'm a valued customer, and this airline knows me." The sound of approaching footsteps announced the arrival of Captain Robert Johnson, a 52-year-old veteran pilot whose weathered face and graying temples spoke to decades of experience dealing with difficult situations at 30,000 feet. Behind him walked Lisa, looking relieved to have passed the problem up the chain of command. "Good afternoon, everyone," Captain Johnson said, his voice carrying the natural authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I understand we have a seating issue that needs to be resolved quickly, so we can maintain our departure schedule." Patricia immediately stood, extending her hand with the gracious smile of someone confident that authority figures would naturally take her side. "Captain Johnson, thank you so much for coming. I'm Patricia Anderson, Elite Platinum member. I'm afraid there's been some kind of computer error with the seat assignments, and this gentleman is being quite unreasonable about finding a solution." Captain Johnson shook her hand politely, then turned to Marcus. "And you are?" "Marcus Washington," Marcus replied, not offering his hand but maintaining steady eye contact. "This is my boarding pass, showing my assignment to seat 2A. Mrs. Anderson has been sitting in my seat since boarding and refuses to move despite having no boarding pass for this seat." The captain examined Marcus's boarding pass carefully, then looked around the first-class cabin, taking in the watching passengers and the obvious tension in the air. He could see the young man with the streaming equipment, the lawyer taking notes, and the multiple phones pointed in his direction. "Mr. Washington, I can see that you're assigned to this seat," However, Mrs. Anderson is a valued long-time customer, and I'm sure we can find an accommodation that works for everyone. Marcus felt the familiar disappointment that came with watching people in authority positions choose the path of least resistance rather than simple fairness. "Captain," Marcus said quietly, "what accommodation would you suggest? That I give up the seat I paid for so that Mrs. Anderson can sit wherever she chooses?" Captain Johnson shifted uncomfortably. "Well, we do have other available seats in first class. Sometimes these situations require a little flexibility from everyone involved." The lawyer in row 3 spoke up again. "Captain Johnson, I'm Carmen Martinez, a civil rights attorney. Are you seriously suggesting that Mr. Washington should give up his assigned seat simply because Mrs. Anderson doesn't want to move? Because if that's airline policy, I'd like to get that on record." The moment that would change everything was about to unfold. Captain Johnson's eyes widened as he recognized the implications of having a civil rights attorney witness and document the situation. What had started as a simple passenger dispute was rapidly becoming a potential legal liability for the airline. "Ma'am, this is just a customer service issue," Captain Johnson said carefully. "We're trying to find a solution that makes everyone comfortable." "Comfortable for whom?" Carmen Martinez pressed, her pen poised over her notepad. "Comfortable for the white woman who took someone else's seat, or comfortable for the black man who's being asked to give up his rights to avoid conflict?" Ashley Davis, the streaming influencer, lowered his phone so everyone could see the screen. "My viewers are asking if this is how airlines normally handle discrimination complaints. We're up to over 5,000 people watching now, and someone just shared it to multiple platforms. The hashtag Flight 2847 discrimination is starting to trend." Captain Johnson looked around the cabin with growing alarm, clearly realizing that what had started as a simple passenger dispute was rapidly becoming a public relations nightmare. The presence of cameras, a lawyer, and thousands of online viewers had transformed the situation into something far beyond his normal experience. "Ladies and gentlemen, I assure you that our airline does not discriminate against anyone," Captain Johnson said, his voice carrying a note of desperation. "We're simply trying to resolve a seating conflict in a way that works for all parties involved." Marcus stood up slowly, his full height making him an imposing presence in the narrow confines of the first-class cabin. When he spoke, his voice carried a new edge that made everyone pay attention. "Captain Johnson, let me be very clear about something. Mrs. Anderson is sitting in my seat. She has no boarding pass for this seat. She has refused multiple requests to move. Your flight attendant suggested that I should be the one to relocate, despite having the legitimate seat assignment. You've now endorsed that same suggestion." Marcus paused, letting his words sink in. "At what point does this stop being customer service and start being discrimination?" The captain opened his mouth to respond, but Marcus held up a hand to stop him. "I'm not finished," Marcus continued. "Mrs. Anderson has accused me of running a compensation scheme, suggested that people like me don't usually fly first class, and implied that my presence here must be fraudulent. All of this has been witnessed by multiple passengers and recorded by at least one of them. Carmen Martinez was typing furiously on her phone, documenting every word. "Mr. Washington is correct, Captain. I've witnessed Mrs. Anderson make several statements that clearly suggest racial bias. Additionally, the airline's response has consistently favored the white passenger over the black passenger, despite the clear evidence of who has the legitimate seat assignment." Patricia, who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable as the legal implications became clear, finally exploded. "This is insane. I refuse to be lectured by someone who probably got his ticket through some kind of affirmative action program or diversity initiative. Real first-class passengers don't dress like they're going to the gym." The words hit the cabin like a physical blow. Several passengers gasped audibly, and Marcus felt something cold and dangerous settle in his chest. Even Captain Johnson took a step back, clearly recognizing that Patricia had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Carmen Martinez was already typing the new quotes into her phone. "Mrs. Anderson, did you just suggest that Mr. Washington couldn't have legitimately purchased a first-class ticket? And did you reference affirmative action in the context of airline seating?" Ashley Davis's live stream exploded with activity. "Oh my God," he said to his camera, She just said that out loud. To everyone watching, she just suggested that a black man in first class must be there because of affirmative action. This is unbelievable. Patricia realized she'd gone too far, but instead of backing down, she doubled down. I'm just saying that there are procedures for these things, and people who belong in first class generally understand how to dress appropriately and behave with some decorum. The older black couple in row 4 shook their heads in disgust. The businessman in row 6 was openly recording now, his phone pointed directly at Patricia. Even some of the white passengers looked uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. Marcus looked at Patricia for a long moment, then at Captain Johnson, then at the dozen or so passengers who were watching with expressions ranging from horror to fascination. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried clearly through the cabin. Captain Johnson, I need to ask you to ground this aircraft immediately. Captain Johnson blinked, as if he hadn't heard correctly. I'm sorry, Mr. Washington, but did you just ask me to ground the aircraft? I didn't ask, Marcus replied, his tone still conversational, but carrying an unmistakable authority that made several passengers sit up straighter. I told you to ground this aircraft. We're not taking off until this situation is properly resolved. Marcus was about to reveal a truth that would stun everyone. Patricia Anderson laughed, a sound that was becoming increasingly shrill with each exchange. Oh, this is rich. Now he thinks he can give orders to the captain. What's next? Are you going to demand they roll out a red carpet for you? Captain Johnson looked genuinely confused. In 30 years of flying, he dealt with difficult passengers, medical emergencies, mechanical failures, and weather delays, but he'd never had a passenger simply order him to ground a flight. Mr. Washington, I appreciate that you're frustrated, but passengers don't have the authority to make operational decisions about aircraft, Captain Johnson said, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone explaining basic facts to a confused individual. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The device was sleek and expensive, but what caught everyone's attention was the confidence with which he held it, as if it contained something that could change the entire situation. Captain, I'm going to make a call. I suggest you listen very carefully to what happens next. Carmen Martinez leaned forward in her seat, her journalist's instincts telling her that something significant was about to happen. Ashley Davis adjusted his phone to get a better angle, his viewer count now climbing past 8,000, as word of the confrontation spread across social media platforms. Marcus tapped his phone screen a few times, then held it up so everyone could see. Instead of making a call, he had opened an app that none of the passengers recognized, a sleek interface with an airline operations logo at the top and what appeared to be various operational controls below it. What is that? Lisa Williams asked, stepping closer to get a better look at the screen. The app displayed a sophisticated dashboard with real-time flight information, passenger manifests, and what appeared to be administrative controls that no ordinary passenger should have access to. Patricia squinted at the screen, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. This, Ms. Williams, is the Executive Control Panel for SkyTech Innovations Airline Operations Division, Marcus said calmly, and this, he tapped a button labeled Ground Flight Owner Override, is what happens when someone pushes a CEO too far. The app processed for a moment, then displayed a confirmation message, Flight 2847 grounded by owner directive, return to gate immediately. Captain Johnson's radio crackled to life almost instantly. Flight 2847, this is tower control. We're showing an owner override order on your flight. Please confirm your status and return to gate immediately. The captain stared at his radio, then at Marcus, then back at his radio, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and dawning recognition. Tower, this is Captain Johnson. Can you repeat that message? Did you say owner override? Affirmative, Captain. We're showing an order directly from SkyTech Innovations corporate office to ground your flight immediately. You're cleared to taxi back to gate C12. Patricia's face had gone pale. What? What just happened? What did you do? The cabin had fallen completely silent, except for the low hum of the aircraft's environmental systems. Every passenger was staring at Marcus as if he had just performed magic, their minds struggling to process what they had just witnessed. Ashley Davis was the first to break the silence, his voice barely above a whisper as he spoke to his camera. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we just witnessed something incredible. This man just grounded an entire aircraft with his phone. Carmen Martinez was typing frantically on her phone, her legal mind already processing the implications of what she had just seen. If Marcus Washington had the authority to ground commercial flights, that meant he was far more than just another passenger. Lisa Williams looked like she was about to be sick. "Mr. Washington, I mean, sir, I had no idea. I was just trying to—" "You were trying to make the problem go away by asking the black passenger to be accommodating," Marcus finished for her. "I understand, Ms. Williams. It's what you've been trained to do. Find the person who looks like they have the least power and ask them to compromise so that the person who looks like they have the most power doesn't have to be inconvenienced." The older black couple in row 4 were looking at Marcus with something approaching awe. In their decades of travel, they had never seen anyone with the power to fight back against airline discrimination in such a dramatic and immediate way. Patricia finally found her voice again, though it came out as more of a croak. I don't understand. Who are you? How can you just ground a plane?" Marcus pocketed his phone and looked at her with an expression that was almost pitying. "Mrs. Anderson, allow me to properly introduce myself. Comment your country and city. Let's see where justice is being celebrated worldwide." The silence in the first-class cabin was so complete that passengers could hear the soft mechanical sounds of the aircraft's systems and the distant murmur of activity from the gate area. Every eye was fixed on Marcus Washington as he prepared to reveal information that would change everything. "My name is Marcus Washington," he began, his voice calm and authoritative. "I'm the Chief Executive Officer of SkyTech Innovations, which owns 67% of this airline through our Transportation Acquisition Division." The words hit the cabin like a physical force. Patricia's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, while Captain Johnson stared at Marcus as if seeing him for the first time. Lisa Williams actually took a step backward, her professional composure crumbling as the full implications of the situation became clear. "In other words," Marcus continued, "I don't just have a seat on this airplane. I own the airplane." Carmen Martinez was the first to break the stunned silence, her voice carrying the excitement of a lawyer who had just stumbled onto the story of a lifetime. "You're Marcus Washington?" The SkyTech CEO who's been featured on the cover of Fortune and Forbes, the tech innovator who revolutionized airline booking systems and digital passenger management. Marcus nodded calmly. "The same. And Mrs. Anderson, since you were so curious about my qualifications to sit in first class, I should mention that SkyTech software powers the reservation system that processed your ticket, the check-in kiosks you used at the airport, and the passenger manifest that Captain Johnson has been consulting throughout this conversation." Patricia's face had gone through several color changes, from pale white to flushed red to an almost green tinge. But you're dressed like... you look like... "Like what, Mrs. Anderson?" Marcus asked quietly. "Like someone who doesn't belong in first class. Like someone who couldn't possibly afford to buy his own airline. Like someone whose presence in spaces of wealth and power must be the result of fraud or charity." Ashley Davis's live stream had exploded into chaos. His viewer count was climbing past 15,000, and the comments were flowing so fast they were impossible to read. "Holy shit," he whispered, then caught himself. "Sorry, this is incredible. The story just completely changed. We're not just watching passenger discrimination, we're watching the owner of the airline respond to discrimination on his own aircraft." Captain Johnson had gone silent, presumably processing the fact that he had just spent the last 45 minutes suggesting that the owner of his airline should be more flexible about giving up his seat. His radio crackled again. "Captain Johnson, this is operations. We need you to return to the gate immediately. There's going to be a corporate representative meeting the aircraft, and we need all passengers to remain on board until further notice." The captain keyed his radio with trembling hands. "Operations, this is Captain Johnson. Understood, beginning taxi back to gate." As the aircraft started its slow movement away from the departure gate, Marcus continued his explanation. "Mrs. Anderson, you asked earlier about my qualifications to fly first class. Beyond owning the airline, SkyTech Innovations is a $15 billion technology company. We employ over 40,000 people worldwide. Our software systems process over 100 million passenger transactions annually. He paused, letting the numbers sink in. I personally hold 347 patents in transportation technology, artificial intelligence, and digital security systems. I graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Business School, and I was named to Fortune's 40 Under 40 list 3 years running. Patricia was now slumped in her seat as if trying to disappear entirely. The reality of her situation was becoming increasingly clear. She had spent the last hour humiliating and insulting one of the most powerful people in the aviation industry. But here's what's really important, Marcus continued, his voice taking on a harder edge. None of those credentials should matter. The fact that I own this airline shouldn't matter. My net worth shouldn't matter. What should matter is that I'm a human being who purchased a ticket, was assigned a seat and deserved to be treated with basic dignity and respect. Carmen Martinez was writing furiously, documenting every word for what she already knew would be a major story. Mr. Washington, what you're describing is exactly the kind of institutional discrimination that civil rights advocates have been fighting for decades. The assumption that successful black people must prove their worthiness to exist in premium spaces. That's exactly right, Marcus replied. And what makes this situation particularly egregious is that even when I showed my boarding pass, even when I remained calm and professional, even when I repeatedly asked for simple fairness, the airline's response was to suggest that I should be the one to compromise. The older black woman in row 4 spoke up, her voice filled with emotion. Mr. Washington, I want to thank you. In 50 years of traveling, I've never seen anyone with the power to fight back like this. You're not just standing up for yourself, you're standing up for all of us. The revelation that followed left the entire cabin speechless. As the aircraft completed its taxi back to gate C-12, Marcus could see through the windows that a crowd was already gathering on the jet bridge. Airport security personnel flanked both sides of the walkway, while a group of what appeared to be airline executives huddled near the gate counter, speaking in urgent whispers. Beyond them, Marcus could see several people with cameras and notepads who had somehow materialized in the hour since his flight had been grounded. But it was the young black woman in an expensive business suit who caught Marcus's attention first. Jordan Chen, his 27-year-old chief of staff, was practically vibrating with nervous energy as she paced near the gate, her phone pressed to her ear and a tablet tucked under her arm. Even through the aircraft windows, Marcus could see the stress on her face. Ladies and gentlemen, Marcus announced, his voice carrying easily through the cabin, I want you to understand something important. What happened here today wasn't about me personally. It wasn't about my company or my money or my position. It was about what happens every day to people who look like me when they try to exist in spaces where they're not expected to belong. He looked directly at Patricia, who was now slumped in her seat as if trying to disappear entirely. Mrs. Anderson refused to acknowledge my legitimate boarding pass because she couldn't believe that someone like me belonged in first class. Ms. Williams suggested that I should be the one to move because it would be easier than making a valued customer face consequences for her actions. Marcus's phone was buzzing constantly now with notifications. Text messages from his board of directors, missed calls from major news outlets, and social media alerts showing that hashtags related to the incident were trending worldwide. Ashley Davis's livestream had reached over 25,000 concurrent viewers, and the story was spreading across multiple platforms simultaneously. Captain Johnson endorsed that suggestion because he assumed that I would be the reasonable one, the one who would compromise to keep the peace, Marcus continued. Every single assumption made about me today was based on nothing more than the color of my skin and my choice to wear comfortable clothes while traveling. Carmen Martinez had been documenting everything, her legal training allowing her to capture not just the words but the broader implications of what she was witnessing. Mr. Washington, what you've described is a textbook case of institutional discrimination. The airline's policies and procedures systematically disadvantaged you based on racial assumptions. That's exactly right, Marcus replied. And that's why this can't end with simple apologies or promises to do better. This has to be about systematic change. As the jet bridge connected to the aircraft and the doors opened, Marcus stood and gathered his belongings. The first-class cabin remained silent as everyone waited to see what would happen next. "Captain Johnson, Miss Williams," Marcus said as he prepared to exit, "I'll be speaking with you both individually very soon. Mrs. Anderson, you'll be hearing from our legal department regarding your permanent ban from all flights operated by airlines using Skytech systems." He paused at the aircraft door and turned back to face the cabin one more time. "And to everyone else who witnessed what happened here today, thank you. Your attention and your willingness to document the truth are the only reasons this story will be heard. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to look away." Patricia finally looked up from her hands, tears streaming down her face. "Mr. Washington, I'm so sorry. I had no idea who you were." "I never meant to—" "Mrs. Anderson," Marcus interrupted gently, "that's exactly the problem. You didn't know who I was, so you felt entitled to treat me as less than human. The issue isn't that you didn't recognize me as a CEO. The issue is that you didn't recognize me as a person deserving of the same respect you'd want for yourself." Ashley Davis was still streaming as Marcus walked past him toward the exit. "Mr. Washington, my viewers want to know, what happens next? How do you plan to make sure this doesn't happen to other people?" Marcus paused, looking directly into the camera that was broadcasting to thousands of people around the world. "What happens next is that we use this moment to create lasting change. Not just for airlines, but for any industry where people are judged by their appearance rather than their humanity." With that, Marcus Washington walked off his own airplane, leaving behind a cabin full of people who were still trying to process what they had just experienced. The jet bridge buzzed with controlled chaos as he stepped off the aircraft, but Marcus was focused on one thing: turning this moment of discrimination into a catalyst for systematic transformation. But this was just the beginning of a revolution. The jet bridge erupted into controlled chaos the moment Marcus stepped off the aircraft. Airport security personnel flanked both sides of the walkway, while airline executives huddled in urgent consultation near the gate counter. But it was Jordan Chen who reached him first, her face a mixture of relief and barely controlled panic. "Marcus, thank God," Jordan said, ending her call and rushing to his side. "I've been fielding calls for the last hour. The story is everywhere. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn, even major news networks are picking it up. CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News have all requested immediate interviews." As they spoke, Marcus could see Ashley Davis emerging from the aircraft, still streaming live to what appeared to be an enormous online audience. The young influencer's viewer count had climbed to over 40,000 concurrent viewers, and his phone was buzzing with notifications from people sharing and commenting on the stream. "What's the current status?" Marcus asked, pulling out his own phone to see dozens of missed calls and hundreds of text messages. "The hashtag Dodger Flight 2847 Justice is trending worldwide," Jordan replied, consulting her tablet. "Skytech stock is up 12% in after-hours trading because investors are viewing this as a positive leadership moment. But the airline subsidiary's reputation is taking a hit, down 8% and falling." Carmen Martinez had also exited the aircraft and was approaching the group, her press credentials clearly visible and her notepad filled with detailed observations. "Mr. Washington, I'm going to be writing about this for several publications. Would you be willing to provide additional comment about your plans going forward?" Before Marcus could respond, his phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he recognized immediately. "Marcus, this is Jake Tapper from CNN," the voice said when he answered. "I'm calling about the incident on Flight 2847. The story is exploding across social media, and we'd like to get your perspective. Would you be available for a live interview within the next hour?" Marcus looked around at the crowd that had gathered in the gate area. What had started as a simple flight to Los Angeles had evolved into an impromptu press conference, with airport officials, journalists, and curious passengers creating a media circus around Gate C-12. "Mr. Tapper," Marcus said, putting the call on speaker so that Carmen and Jordan could hear, "I'll be happy to speak with you, but I want to be clear about something. This isn't just about one incident on one flight. This is about systematic discrimination that happens every day in the airline industry, and I'm planning to do something comprehensive about it. Mr. Washington, we've seen the video footage that's gone viral, and we've spoken with several passengers from Flight 2847, Tapper continued. Can you tell us exactly what you plan to do with the platform this incident has given you? Marcus looked directly at Ashley Davis, who was still streaming, and had positioned himself to capture the impromptu press conference. The young man's audience had grown to over 50,000 viewers, and Marcus could see comments flowing past on the screen, expressions of support, shared stories of discrimination, and calls for systematic change. Mr. Tapper, what happened to me today could happen on any airline in any airport, to any person who doesn't fit someone else's preconceptions about who belongs where. The fact that it happened to me, someone with the power and platform to do something about it, means that it's my responsibility to ensure it doesn't happen to anyone else. A murmur rippled through the crowd of listeners as Marcus outlined the scope of his plans. Jordan was taking notes, while Carmen Martinez documented every word for what she already knew would be a major investigative piece. We're going to implement the most comprehensive anti-discrimination reporting and prevention system in transportation history, Marcus continued. SkyTech software powers passenger management systems for over 70% of commercial airlines in North America. We're going to integrate bias detection and reporting mechanisms directly into those systems. Jake Tapper's voice carried excitement as he processed the implications. Mr. Washington, are you saying you're going to use your technological platform to force industry-wide changes in how airlines handle discrimination? I'm saying I'm going to use every tool at my disposal to make sure that what happened to me today never happens to anyone else, Marcus replied. And if other airlines don't want to participate voluntarily, they can find different software providers. The crowd around the gate had grown significantly. Passengers from other flights had heard about the incident and come to witness what was clearly becoming a historic moment. Several people were recording with their phones, and Marcus could see that multiple news outlets were now represented among the gathered journalists. Patricia Anderson emerged from the aircraft, looking like she had aged 10 years in the past 2 hours. Her perfect makeup was streaked with tears, her designer clothes rumpled, and her confident demeanor completely shattered. She moved quickly through the crowd, clearly hoping to avoid additional attention, but several cameras captured her exit. 3 years later, the transformation was complete. 3 years after Flight 2847, Marcus Washington stood in the gleaming conference room of SkyTech Innovations headquarters, looking out at a room filled with airline executives, civil rights leaders, technology innovators, and government officials. The quarterly Civil Rights in Transportation Summit had become one of the most important industry gatherings, and today's session was focused on measuring the impact of the changes that had swept through the aviation industry. Ladies and gentlemen, Marcus began, 3 years ago I was discriminated against on my own airline. Today I want to share with you the data that shows how we've transformed not just air travel, but transportation discrimination across multiple industries. The presentation screen behind him displayed impressive statistics. Discrimination complaints in air travel had decreased by 87% industry-wide. Customer satisfaction among minority passengers had increased by 94%. Most importantly, the reporting and resolution rate for discrimination incidents had improved from less than 2% to over 96%. Carmen Martinez, now working as SkyTech's Director of Civil Rights Compliance, stood to present the legal framework that had emerged from that day on Flight 2847. The Marcus Washington Protocol, as it had become known, required real-time documentation of all passenger interactions, automatic escalation of discrimination complaints, and transparent public reporting of resolution outcomes. What we discovered, Carmen explained, was that most discrimination in transportation wasn't intentional malice. It was unconscious bias amplified by systems that didn't hold anyone accountable. When we made bias visible and consequences immediate, behavior changed rapidly. Ashley Davis, whose livestream had captured the original incident, was now one of the most respected voices in social justice media. His documentary about systematic discrimination had won multiple awards, and his advocacy work had inspired similar transparency efforts in retail, hospitality, and healthcare. The power of that moment on Flight 2847, Ashley said from his seat in the front row, wasn't just that one powerful person fought back against discrimination. It was that the technology existed to make change immediate and systematic. Instead of waiting for lawsuits or legislation, we used market forces and technological leverage to create instant accountability. The room included several of the original passengers from Flight 2847. The older black couple from row 4, Dr. and Mrs. James Thompson, had become advocates for senior citizen travel rights. Their testimonies about decades of discrimination had helped shape policies protecting elderly passengers from bias based on age, mobility, or perceived economic status. For 50 years, Dr. C. Thompson said when invited to speak, "My wife and I experienced the same kind of treatment that Mr. Washington faced, but we never had the power to fight back. What's remarkable about the changes we've seen is that they don't just protect people with power. They protect everyone." The presentation continued with data from international implementations. The European Union had adopted similar bias detection systems across all transportation modes. Asian airlines had implemented cultural sensitivity training programs. Even ride-sharing services and public transportation systems had integrated real-time discrimination prevention protocols. Marcus clicked to the next slide, showing employment data from the transportation industry. One of the most significant changes has been in hiring and promotion practices. When companies know that discriminatory behavior will be immediately visible and actionable, they become much more careful about who they put in customer-facing positions. Lisa Williams, the flight attendant from Flight 2847, was now SkyTech's Director of Customer Experience Training. Her journey from someone who had initially supported discriminatory policies to someone who designed systems to prevent them had become a case study in corporate transformation. "The training we received before was all about avoiding problems," Lisa explained. "We were taught to placate difficult customers, to find compromises that didn't upset anyone. We were never taught to recognize when our idea of compromise was actually enabling discrimination." Captain Johnson had retired from flying, but worked as a consultant, helping other airlines implement bias prevention protocols. His experience on Flight 2847 had fundamentally changed his understanding of how authority figures unconsciously perpetuate discriminatory systems. The most powerful presentation came from Patricia Anderson herself, the woman who had triggered the entire transformation by refusing to give up a seat that wasn't hers, had undergone her own journey of understanding and accountability. "I spent my entire life believing that my comfort and preferences were more important than other people's rights," Patricia said, her voice barely audible. "What happened on Flight 2847 forced me to confront the reality that my actions had consequences for real people. The work I've done since then, advocating for bias training in real estate, hospitality, and retail, is my attempt to repair some of the damage I caused." Marcus looked around the room at the faces of people who had been transformed by a single moment of standing up against discrimination. The technology executives who had redesigned systems to promote fairness. The government officials who had crafted new regulations. The industry leaders who had embraced transparency over profit protection. What started as discrimination became a movement for change. The impact of the Flight 2847 incident had rippled far beyond the aviation industry. Marcus's phone displayed a notification from the United Nations Human Rights Council, informing him that the international body was voting on global standards for bias prevention in transportation. The Marcus Washington Protocol was being considered as a model for worldwide implementation. "Jordan," Marcus said to his chief of staff, "pull up the international adoption data for the quarterly board meeting." Jordan's tablet displayed an interactive map showing countries that had implemented some version of the bias detection and prevention systems that had emerged from that day 3 years ago. The results were remarkable. 47 countries had integrated real-time discrimination reporting into their transportation systems, and 23 had expanded the protocols to include housing, employment, and healthcare. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Some airlines had initially threatened to find alternative software providers rather than implement the bias detection systems. However, The practical reality was that replacing Skytech's integrated passenger management systems would have taken years and cost billions of dollars. Most importantly, consumer pressure had made discrimination prevention a competitive advantage, rather than a regulatory burden. Marcus received a text from Elena Rodriguez, a documentary filmmaker who had turned Ashley Davis's original live stream into a feature-length film that had premiered at Sundance. Marcus, the film just got picked up for distribution by a major streaming platform. We're estimating it will reach over 100 million viewers worldwide. The documentary, titled Seat 2A: How One Flight Changed Everything, had become more than just a film about airline discrimination. It was a comprehensive examination of how technology could be used to enforce civil rights in real time, and how individual acts of courage could create systematic change. Carmen Martinez had just returned from a speaking engagement at Harvard Law School, where she had presented a case study on using technological leverage to advance civil rights. "The students are incredible," she told Marcus. "They're developing apps and platforms specifically designed to identify and prevent discrimination in industries we haven't even thought about yet." The Harvard presentation had included testimony from Dr. Beverly Williams, a civil rights attorney who had helped expand the bias prevention model to K-12 education. School districts across the country were now using similar real-time monitoring systems to ensure that students of all backgrounds received equal treatment and opportunities. What we learned from the airline industry, Dr. Williams had explained to the law students, was that discrimination often isn't conscious malice. It's unconscious bias that goes unchecked because systems don't require accountability. When you make bias visible and consequences immediate, behavior changes dramatically. Marcus's reflection was interrupted by a call from an unexpected source. The CEO of a major retail chain who wanted to implement similar bias detection systems in customer service interactions. The business case had become compelling. Companies with transparent bias prevention systems were seeing improved customer satisfaction, increased loyalty from diverse communities, and reduced legal liability. "Mr. Washington," the retail executive said, "our data shows that stores with bias prevention protocols have 23% higher customer satisfaction ratings and 34% better retention rates among minority customers. We're not just talking about doing the right thing anymore. We're talking about competitive advantage." The conversation was interrupted by breaking news on Marcus's phone. A major airline in Europe had just announced that they were implementing the Marcus Washington Protocol across their entire fleet, following pressure from both passengers and investors who viewed bias prevention as a sign of progressive corporate leadership. Ashley Davis had built his initial viral moment into a media empire focused on social justice advocacy. His latest project was a reality series that followed companies implementing bias prevention systems, showing both the challenges and the transformative results. "The power of technology to enforce fairness is incredible," Ashley said in his latest broadcast to over 2 million subscribers. "But what's even more powerful is seeing how individual courage can create systematic change." Marcus Washington didn't just stand up for himself. He used his position to make sure that millions of other people would never have to experience what he experienced. The ripple effects continued to expand. Universities were integrating bias detection into admissions processes. Healthcare systems were implementing protocols to ensure equal treatment for patients, regardless of appearance or perceived economic status. Even government agencies were adopting transparency measures that made discriminatory practices immediately visible and actionable. Marcus looked at his calendar for the following week. He had meetings scheduled with transportation ministers from 6 countries, all seeking to implement versions of the bias prevention systems that had emerged from Flight 2847. The European Union was finalizing legislation that would require real-time discrimination monitoring across all member nations. But perhaps most importantly, Marcus was scheduled to speak at a high school in Detroit, where students had requested a presentation about using technology and platform responsibility to advance civil rights. The next generation was already thinking about problems and solutions that went far beyond anything Marcus had imagined 3 years ago. The ripple effects would reshape an entire industry. 5 years after Flight 2847, Marcus Washington stood once again in the first-class cabin of an aircraft, but this time the circumstances were entirely different. He was touring the newest Skytech-equipped plane, which featured integrated bias detection systems, real-time passenger feedback mechanisms, and the most advanced customer equity protocols in aviation history. The flight attendant conducting the tour was Kevin Martinez, a young black man whose confident interactions with passengers of all backgrounds reflected the culture change that had swept through the airline industry. His name tag read Customer Equity Specialist, a position that hadn't existed before Flight 2847, but was now standard across the industry. "Mr. Washington," Kevin said as they walked through the cabin, "I wanted to personally thank you. I've been working in airline customer service for 7 years, and your advocacy completely transformed what it means to do this job. Instead of being trained to avoid problems, we're now trained to solve them fairly." Marcus checked in for a flight to Geneva, where he would be addressing the World Economic Forum about the global expansion of bias prevention technology. The check-in process was seamless, with systems that monitored every interaction for potential discrimination and provided real-time feedback to both staff and passengers. As he settled into Seat 2A, the same seat number that had started everything, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him from a frustrated passenger to a global leader in civil rights technology. His phone displayed messages from colleagues around the world who were implementing similar systems in healthcare, education, housing, and employment. Carmen Martinez, now serving as the UN Special Rapporteur on Technology and Human Rights, had sent him an update on the previous week's vote. "Marcus, the Global Protocol for Transportation Equity passed with 187 countries supporting. Your model is now international law." The aircraft was equipped with displays throughout the cabin that provided real-time information about passenger rights, discrimination reporting mechanisms, and the airline's commitment to equal treatment. What had once been revolutionary was now simply standard practice. The idea that discrimination should be immediately visible and actionable had become as basic as safety protocols. Ashley Davis, whose original live stream had documented the Flight 2847 incident, was now one of the most respected voices in social justice media. His latest project was a comprehensive study of how the bias prevention model had been adapted across different industries and cultures worldwide. "The beautiful thing about what started on Flight 2847, Ashley said in his latest documentary, wasn't just that one powerful person fought back against discrimination, it was that the solution was scalable. The same technology that prevented airline discrimination could prevent housing discrimination, employment discrimination, healthcare discrimination, any situation where unconscious bias affects how people are treated." The flight attendant making the safety announcement was Sarah Chen, who had been promoted to Director of Inclusive Customer Experience for the entire airline group. Her presence on this particular flight was intentional. She often worked flights to demonstrate how far the industry had come. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah announced over the intercom, "welcome aboard Flight 1847 to Geneva. As we prepare for departure, I want to remind you that this airline is committed to ensuring that every passenger travels with dignity and respect, regardless of background, appearance, or any other factor." She paused, looking directly at Marcus. 5 years ago, this flight was the site of a discrimination incident that sparked a global movement for civil rights in transportation. Today, thanks to the courage of passengers who refuse to accept unfair treatment and the technology that makes accountability possible, air travel is safer and more welcoming for everyone. As the aircraft lifted off, Marcus looked out the window at the city where he had built a technology empire that was now being used to enforce civil rights around the world. His phone displayed a notification from the White House, informing him that the president would be signing expanded civil rights legislation inspired by his work. But Marcus's attention was drawn to a conversation happening across the aisle, where a young Latina girl was asking her grandmother about the equity displays throughout the aircraft. "Abuela, what do those screens mean?" the girl asked in Spanish. Her grandmother smiled and replied also in Spanish, "They mean that people like us are welcome here, mija." They mean that we don't have to worry about being treated badly because of how we look or where we come from. Marcus understood enough Spanish to follow the conversation, and he realized that this was the real measure of success. Not the awards or the congressional hearings or the international recognition, but the simple fact that a young girl could travel without fear of discrimination because someone had refused to accept unfair treatment and had used their power to create systematic change. Thank you to everyone who typed justice and told us where you're from. Seeing this support from viewers around the world proves that the fight for dignity and respect in travel is universal, and your voice matters in making that change happen. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think differently about standing up for what's right, hit that like button and subscribe to help these stories reach more people who need to hear them. Because dignity isn't negotiable, justice isn't optional, and your voice matters more than you know.